From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Early voting surging in the swing states as we speak, including Georgia, where Donald Trump is holding multiple events today. Vice President Kamala Harris returning to Pennsylvania for a televised town hall tonight. We're joined ahead by political scientist Lara Brown on the strategies for the remaining 13 days of this campaign. We'll also talk with Bloomberg Opinion's Mary Ellen Klas, who looks at the side effect of a divided nation, single-party state governments. And later this hour, the Pentagon says North Korean troops are now inside Russia, training to help in Moscow's war against Ukraine. We'll have more on this. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's trip to Israel as well, with James Jeffrey, the former ambassador to Iraq and Turkey. Thank you for joining us today. The Wednesday edition of Balance of Power, the late edition here on Bloomberg TV and radio, driving the conversation today in the campaign, an interview that former Trump Chief of Staff John Kelly, the retired general, gave to the New York Times, where he said the former president met the definition of a fascist. Vice President Harris seizing the opportunity to comment on this today from Washington.
It is deeply troubling and incredibly dangerous that Donald Trump would invoke Adolf Hitler, the man who is responsible for the deaths of 6 million Jews and hundreds of thousands of Americans. It is clear from John Kelly's words that Donald Trump is someone who, I quote, certainly falls into the general definition of fascist.
And that's just how we started the day today. Joining us now, Bloomberg's Hadriana Lowenkron, fresh off the campaign trail, and Bloomberg's Mike Dorning with us in Washington. Great to see both of you, and welcome. Mike, your thoughts on the impact of not just this story. We've heard about these conversations before with Donald Trump in a reportedly, supposedly fashion. This is in his own voice now in an interview. Is it too late to have an impact? What does it mean?
I don't think it's too late to have an impact. And I think, as you said, it's really important that you actually have the audio of John Kelly saying this. We've seen this these facts have leaked out before from an anonymous source that was pretty clearly John Kelly all along. But now we have the president's former chief of staff talking about, this sort of comparisons with Hitler, that he's a fascist, and also denigrating service members. In this election, which is like a 50-50 nose to nose, if you depress the turnout of veterans who are pro-Trump, if you depress the turnout of some suburban Republicans who like Trump lesser of two evils, that could make a big difference. So, and even more so if it unleashes more on the record, on video, or on audio stuff from major figures in his campaign. You wonder if this gives others, like retired General Kelly, cover to say similar things about Donald Trump. But, Hadriana, you've been at so many Trump rallies. You've been around the MAGA experience in a lot of different forms since before the attempted assassination, what these rallies have become now. The people who are supporting Donald Trump are not moved by a story like this. In fact, he can get applause lines insulting the generals who work for him.
Right. I mean, loyalty is everything with Trump and his base. And one thing that has stayed the same, if not maybe has been enhanced, is the fact that he still has his base essentially ride or die for him right now. But I mean, to the point of what does this mean for, people who are still on the fence? There are still, in fact, people on the fence, and things being so close. Could this, potentially move the needle? I mean, I think that's what the Harris campaign is hoping for, right? At this point, any opportunity to seize on something and have that be the story of the day because the news cycle matters. I mean, this is, of course, a day or two after the Harris campaign jumped on the fact that Trump had this kind of stunt at McDonald's, right? And during that moment of him in the drive-through window, he was asked, what do you think about, raising minimum wage? And he sidestepped the question. And then what happens next? the news of Harris now saying, yes, I, do in fact support bumping that up,
That's
now
right.
saying even $15. Obviously, depends on what Congress, has
Sure.
to say about that. But that's kind of where we're at right now, is using these events. And it's a real back and forth.
They continue to prod each other with
Right.
these policy proposals in a really interesting way. We heard from Kamala Harris a short time ago at the Naval Observatory, the residence of the vice president. Let's hear from Donald Trump, campaigning in Florida, had this to say with this idea of absolute power, as we're just discussing, about the authority of the president and immigration. Let's listen.
As president, you have it's called extreme power. You have extreme power. You can just by the fact you say, close the border, and the border is closed. That's it. Very, very simple. You don't need all of this nonsense that they talk about.
Mike, part of this is about the references to Hitler, that even he did good things, which is clearly not something that most Americans are willing to entertain. But the idea of the power and the potency of the executive, this is attractive to some people. You don't have to wait around for Congress. Yeah. Close the border. Is that more of what he meant?
I think that's what he meant. It was, from his standpoint, unfortunate to be focusing on extreme power right now and use that term, extreme power.
He did.
But he's trying to keep this focused on immigration, not abortion, not, Adolf Hitler or anything like that. But on immigration, there's a clear contrast that favors him. Most people are concerned about immigration, just, whatever the particulars, they feel like Trump is going to be more serious about keeping more illegal immigrants out of the undocumented workers out of the country than Harris will be. So he doesn't need to get into the nitty-gritty. If you can just focus on this, that will help him, and that's what he's trying to do.
Well, as they're arguing over this, both campaigns are crafting closing acts for the next couple of weeks here. You're going to be busy. Hadriana, it's going to be Bruce Springsteen on the road tomorrow night, right? He's going to Georgia. He's going to Philadelphia. We had Eminem last evening in Detroit. Donald Trump is surrounding himself, by the way, they're all with Kamala Harris, I think we've established. Donald Trump is surrounding himself with Joe Rogan. He's going to be doing a big sit-down interview at the end of this week, and Tucker Carlson's going to be taking part. Real contrasts here in the images that voters will be left with for at least those who will be voting on Election Day.
Yeah, some interesting decision-making for sure. When you're looking at the groups that Trump needs and you're looking at who Trump will be appearing with, it might not seem like they add up, in the sense that he is still looking for these suburban women voters. He has made comments in the past. He's kind of backtracking when it comes to calling himself, the father of IVF, and, saying I'm the protector of women. All of these comments that could potentially, turn women off from the campaign. This is an area where he should perhaps double down on. Areas like young men and men of color. These are areas that he is seeing a bump on. Yeah. So perhaps this is, him trying to double down, thinking maybe that's a better bet to get more of those numbers than a group that has already kind of moved away. Another area he's really been focusing on has been Christian voters. I mean, he was just at the Al Smith dinner. That's something that we know that Harris herself did not end up going to. He's tried to capitalize on that. But then at the same time, the tonal shift, making these more kind of vulgar remarks at these rallies that could potentially undercut that strategy as well. So, we'll continue to see what kind of thematic and tonal messaging comes out of this. Something else that's interesting is the economy more important, or is the border? He's going back and forth. I think, advisors are really trying to have him focus on the economy, but the border just continues to creep up there for him. Yeah. And we know it's still important to voters as well. And both of them are issues that he is, polling shows has an advantage over Harris. So maybe it's fine to kind of focus on both, but it'll be interesting to see if there is any shift between the two.
Well, you do wonder if anyone's trying to pick off undecided voters at this point, or simply trying to mobilize their base to get out and vote in a turnout election. Bloomberg's Hadriana Lowenkron, Mike Dorning, thank you so much for great reporting and a great talk today on Balance of Power. Coming up with less than 2 weeks until Election Day now, it's 13 days off. We'll have a closer look at Kamala Harris and Donald Trump's final appeal to voters, as we were just discussing, with political scientist Lara Brown. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I personally think that Harris has done some very interesting things by going on Brett Baer. People who might have doubted her, she stood her ground. She might even go do Joe Rogan. Trump is not going into hostile territory. I think that her strategy probably is a stronger media strategy.
That's Jane Hall, associate professor at American University, talking with us on the early edition of Balance of Power on the different media strategies being employed now by each of the presidential candidates. Their campaigns are taking this differently. That strategy pushing Harris to a town hall tonight on CNN, as Donald Trump's strategy has him campaigning in the swing state of Georgia today. But very interesting, swing states aside, the people they are surrounding themselves with. And joining me now, political scientist Lara Brown. It's great to see you, Lara. Welcome back as you kind of back off this moment in time here and look at the next week, some of the events that are scheduled. We do have the two that I mentioned, of course, tonight. And by the way, Donald Trump is going to be sharing a stage with Tucker Carlson, I understand, tonight in Georgia. Then it's going to be on to an event with Barack Obama and Bruce Springsteen, who will be in Georgia and in Pennsylvania over the course of the next week. We saw Eminem last evening in Detroit. It's celebrity season here. And based on some of the names that I mentioned, Kid Rock is hanging out with Donald Trump, Eminem, Kamala Harris. This doesn't sound like we're trying to reach undecided voters, but trying to mobilize the people we have. Do you see it that way?
Well, there certainly is a desire to mobilize voters that you believe are already in your camp. I do think there's a specific focus on young men, and some of that has to do with the fact that the early vote right now has indicated that at least young women are voting in higher proportions, and they are very much in favor of Harris. So this question of, are the young men going to, in fact, turn out? And can Donald Trump, who has attracted them in polls, actually have them get all the way to the ballot box?
That's a big question, of course. And it strikes me that it might be time better spent ensuring that people you know support you get to the polls than trying to identify this endangered species called the undecided voter. It speaks directly to the people who are surrounding the campaigns, right? If Donald Trump wanted to move to the center and find people who might otherwise be considering Kamala Harris, would he be on stage with Tucker Carlson tonight?
I don't think so. I mean, really what is going on is that the Harris campaign has a very sophisticated field organization. They have put a lot of money and a lot of effort and time into building it. And I think what you see with Elon Musk and the Trump campaign having outsourced their field program to his super PAC is that they're still identifying voters. And it is not the time to be identifying people. It is the time to be encouraging people and getting them across that finish line.
Well, and there's a question about whether any of this works for anybody anyway, Lara, and you know where I'm going here. We talked in the early edition of Balance of Power with Andra Gillespie, a political science professor at Emory University, surrounded by what's happening right now in Georgia, and had this to say about the impact of celeb endorsements this close to Election Day.
The literature in political science is actually somewhat dubious about whether or not celebrity endorsements matter in terms of persuading people to change their minds. The types of people who are going to show up to these events are already committed partisans who are already committed to Trump or Harris before they knew who was going to headline this particular rally. The most important thing about rallies and the most important thing about celebrity headliners is the earned media. So we're talking about them. We're giving free advertising to both the Trump and the Harris campaigns because of the fact that they got cool people to show up for them at a campaign, depending on what your definition of cool is.
I don't know your definition of cool here, Lara, but I do want to key off the idea of earned media because, you know, Donald Trump is supposed to be the king of earned media, and I'm told that that is why his campaign will spend $1 million to essentially rent out Madison Square Garden for the night to hold a big rally in the middle of New York City, which is, of course, a deep shade of blue. Is the idea correct, though, that this is a national election and he'll get monster coverage by doing this?
Well, he may get monster coverage, but that may not help him in the states that he needs the voters. I do think celebrity endorsements, as Dr. Gillespie said, are about headliners. They are about getting that media attention, but they do also kind of excite voters, right? They excite those who are already planning to vote for you, which is why this is the perfect time to roll them out. If you are going to get your people to the polls, you want to do it sort of now, get them feeling excited, get them going to an event and then to the ballot box the next day.
Got to ask you about the impact of early voting, because a lot of people aren't waiting around to find out who's endorsing whom. They've already cast their ballots. Lara, this is remarkable. Nevada joins the parade here. We're seeing an incredible turnout for Republicans. At last check, 39% of the roughly 245,000 ballots submitted by Monday evening, this is where the number came from, Republicans, 36% Democrats. Look at what we're seeing as well, meantime, in Georgia, topping 2 million ballots after the first day of early voting. I know there's a lot of noise around these numbers, and most states do not delineate between D's and R's. But what does this opening surge tell you about overall turnout?
What it tells me is we're going to have high turnout. I think there are a lot of people on both sides of the aisle that are excited about getting out there and participating in this election. I do believe most people see this as a high stakes election, and they see very stark choices before them. So there is a desire to get there and have your vote count as early as possible. It is also true that I hesitate to read into these partisan identification numbers, because I do anticipate that we will see some Democrats deciding to vote for Trump. It could be, Latino and Black men. There has been some suggestion of that. We could also see Republican women voting for Harris. And certainly we know that that is why former Congresswoman Liz Cheney campaigned with Vice President Harris in 3 suburban counties of 3 swing states the other day.
I want to ask you about some of the demographics that you've referred to here, because these campaigns are geo-targeting on a level that we've never seen before, as they chase, in the case of Kamala Harris, young men of color. In the case of Donald Trump, trying to keep those gains, but also blast out messages to women where he's showing some weakness. And this has become almost a gender-driven election here. Last night, in her interview on NBC News, Vice President Harris had this to say about the role of gender in the race. Lara, let's listen.
The experience that I am having is one in which it is clear that regardless of someone's gender, they want to know that their president has a plan to lower cost, that their president has a plan to secure America in the context of our position around the world. They want a president of the United States who honors our military, who understands the importance of America's leadership around international rules and norms. And that is regardless of gender.
You might like that answer, Lara, and I suspect that she was ready for that question. But this race is being framed in many ways as men versus women. Is that not right?
It is. And you don't need to have anyone talk about it for that to be the case. We have on the table 2 candidates of different genders, and we also have the situation where Roe versus Wade was overturned and reproductive rights are on the ballot. This is really a sort of central question for women in some ways, but also men. It really comes down to what sort of country are you imagining? Are you imagining a country where women have reproductive rights and control and autonomy of their bodies? Or are you imagining a world in which we are going back to, sort of a pre-Roe conception of a family and a church and a state that all actually weigh in on what the woman is allowed and permitted to do.
Great to have you back with us, Lara. Lara Brown, political scientist with 13 days to the election. Good to talk with you. Coming up, a story that's under the radar here. The number of states that have single-party control, one party controlling all levers of power on the state level. 82% of the United States living in that situation. We'll talk about what it means for people living there. This is next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for joining us. The political divisions in this country have a side effect beyond the close presidential election that we talk about every day here on Bloomberg. A closer look at state-level governments finds 82% of Americans live in a one-party controlled state where either Democrats or Republicans control the governorship and both legislative bodies. Bloomberg Opinion's Mary Ellen Klas is writing about what the result means for the people living in those states. And she joins us now. Mary, great piece, and thank you for joining us here. What is the result on what's supposed to be a representative democracy?
Well, what's happening is that, when you have one-party rule, it suppresses competition and that discourages voter engagement. And that really kind of incentivizes the party in power to pretty much ignore perspectives outside of its base. So we looked at the data, and it's fascinating because since 2000, when you look at the states with one-party control, there's really been a difference in how these states respond to public opinion. And we found that in states that are controlled by Republicans, about 53% of the major policies passed received the support of the majority of voters. But in states controlled by Democrats, those numbers have been rising consistently. And now they're about 77% of the policies are representative of where the public wants. So it's been an interesting dynamic to observe these.
That is for sure. You point out 5 states in which are the exception to the vanishing partisanship here: Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, VA. Not lost on us. Those are all swing states in this election, aren't they?
Right, with the exception of Virginia, but that has been a swing state. And that is significant because the reason they are swing states is because the margins for either party are not enough to swing it one way or the other. So it's an indication that is where that's where competition for this presidential election is. And obviously, those are places also where we're seeing more competition at the legislative level. And that is so healthy for democracy.
I'll point everyone to your story on the terminal and online. Bloomberg Opinion's Mary Ellen Klas. Mary, thanks for being with us. It's great to see you. Coming up, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin says that North Korea has deployed troops into Russia. We'll look at what this means for the war in Ukraine with James Jeffrey, former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We are seeing evidence that there are North Korean troops that have gone to Africa. Now, what exactly? Excuse me, not Africa, but Russia. What exactly they're doing, left to be seen. These are things that we need to sort out. We'll have more for you on that later. But yeah, as we continue to look at this, there is evidence that there are DPRK troops, in Russia.
Calling the situation very, very serious. The Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, talking earlier today, there is evidence the Pentagon now possesses that North Korea has, in fact, sent troops into Russia. Joining us now, a closer look at this and more. James Jeffrey, the former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, chair of the Wilson Center's Middle East program. Mr. Ambassador, welcome back. These troops are presumably training in Russia to be used against Ukraine. What does this mean for the next phase of this war?
First of all, they're not only being trained to be used in the front. Russia has hundreds of thousands of troops, 1,500 Koreans. What they're being also trained for is an eventual attack on South Korea, where we have 28,000 troops, along with our South Korean treaty allies. I want to underline what this does is it, again, indicates we are facing a global military challenge by nuclear-armed states to the international order we put together after World War II. The second point is, I don't want to get political, I haven't heard either presidential candidate who will be the commander-in-chief, one of them, in the next 4 months, say anything about this to the American people, whereas I can't think of anything more important to be telling our fellow Americans.
What will they learn? What will these North Korean troops learn in Russia that they couldn't learn at home?
First of all, they'll learn how to cope with American equipment and people who are trained by the United States. I mean, as a former infantryman, there's nothing like frontline combat experience. Not only the things you learn in a technical sense, you also learn a lot about yourself. You learn how to, frankly, get down when you're being shot at and things like that. That sound obvious, but trust me, if not, I didn't.
Well, then, thank you for your service. As always, Ambassador, will they be put into Ukraine so they can have a live firing experience? To what extent will Ukraine be involved in this, if at all?
Well, we don't know so far. I suspect that the Russians will be doing this not because they expect to get a whole lot more, if you will, cannon fodder from the North Koreans, but in order to show solidarity. Up to now, and this is a very important point, despite this recent BRICS meeting in Russia with China and India and such, Russia doesn't really have a whole lot of support. People buy their oil, to be sure, because it's at a discount. But no country has joined Russia, not even its close ally Belarus on Ukraine's northern flank. No country has joined Russia, and China won't even give it lethal weapons. So Russia is seeking desperately some kind of international, if you will, international legion to show that it's not alone. And the best it can come up with is the pathetic North Koreans.
John Kirby asking today at the White House, speaking for the national security apparatus inside this administration, what does Kim Jong-un think he's getting out of this, Ambassador? Do you have an answer?
Well, first of all, he will get support. I mean, Russia, and to a lesser extent China, long since has moved away from the situation 20 years ago where they were working cooperatively with the U.S., with South Korea, with Japan, to try to stem North Korea's nuclear ambitions. Now, China is ambivalent, and Russia, in many respects, seems to be supporting the North Koreans in some of their technological development and production, which is very worrisome. So clearly, what Kim Jong-un is getting is something he needs. Even if there's anybody more isolated than Putin, it's Kim Jong-un, and he needs this, and he's going to make the most out of it.
The aforementioned John Kirby, as we consider a dangerous world, Ambassador, was also asked today about what's happening in Israel, remembering that Secretary of State Antony Blinken has made his way to Israel as we stand by for Israel's response to Iran. But there's also continued fighting between Israel and Hamas and Israel and Hezbollah on the northern border. This is John Kirby at the White House briefing earlier when he was asked about Israel's strategy, specifically in Lebanon.
They have a right to defend themselves. There are legitimate threats that Hezbollah still poses to the Israeli people. I mean, rockets and missiles are still being fired at Israeli cities. So let's not forget what Hezbollah continues to be able to do. That's number one. Number two, we have said many, many times that we don't support daily strikes into heavily populated areas, and that remains the case today.
When you hear John Kirby talking like that, Ambassador, to what extent do you see this administration having any influence on what happens next? And if the Secretary of State is in Israel, what does that tell you about the time frame on a response to Iran?
Tony Blinken, who's never heard a shot fired in anger, isn't going to tell Bibi Netanyahu, who was once wounded leading Israel's most elite commando force, when to do this or that military operation, including the strike on Iran. The Israelis will do it. In terms of the other, the Blinken trip and what we heard Kirby say, this administration has a split personality to some degree, and Kirby reflects that. Israel has the right to defend itself. It's being shot at, to be sure, but the administration defines defend yourself in a very, very passive way. You can shoot at missiles coming at you, but please do a ceasefire. Don't bomb Beirut. Why not? Why are we saying don't bomb heavily populated areas every day? The Israelis believe they are fighting a war, like we've fought a half a dozen wars since World War II. And believe me, we bombed populated areas in every one of them. Unlike the Israelis, we were never in an existential war since World War II. The Israelis are in one now. This is not helpful advice, trust me, and it's not being listened to, obviously.
Well, it's not being listened to, although I wonder, Ambassador, how worried you are about how this type of bombing continues to act as a recruitment tool and an opportunity to make more terrorists. Is this not part of the equation?
Look, one of the problems we have, and I lived through it, I was involved in it, is we draw all of our lessons about war from our field experiences trying to, on the back of a tank, yank very, very different societies into the 20th century in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that didn't work out. And believe me, trust me, I watched it. We were creating additional terrorists in a population that was neutral initially, and that can happen. But when a terrorist group becomes an organized army and governs a country, which Hamas did formally in Gaza and Hezbollah does essentially informally in all of Lebanon, they can recruit as many people as possible. They don't need Israeli bombings to create more recruits. Believe me, they get plenty of volunteers. And if they don't get volunteers, they will just dragoon people to fight with them. Nobody's going to argue with them. This is very different than, for example, al-Qaeda elements hiding in Anbar province in Iraq in 2004.
Something you know a lot about. James Jeffrey, it's good to see you, sir, former U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Turkey. As I mentioned, he's now chair of the Wilson Center's Middle East program. Good to have you back on Bloomberg. Coming up, early voting is underway and setting records in some states as Kamala Harris and Donald Trump continue their final push on the campaign trail. 13 to go. Our political panel is next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Before 2020, absentee and early voting had been the province of Democrats or older white voters in particular. I think what we're seeing is a return to the equilibrium where early voting, it tends to be something that older, whiter voters do because our older population is less racially diverse.
Andra Gillespie, political science professor at Emory University, talking with me on the early edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you for joining us. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Even though Election Day is now less than 2 weeks off, 13, but who's counting? 13 days. Early voting is well underway. It's already started in 49 states across the country. And in swing state Georgia alone, which just started voting, more than a quarter of registered voters appear to have already cast ballots. We're at 27% or higher now. Joining us, our political panel. Kristen Hahn, partner at Rock Solutions, Democratic strategist, joined today by Republican strategist John Seaton, founder CEO of Echo Canyon Consulting. It's great to see both of you. Kristen, these numbers are impressive for Republicans. Look at what's happening in Nevada, where almost 40% of the roughly 245,000 ballots submitted by Monday evening came from Republicans, more than Democrats. The RNC seems to have gotten its arms around this concept once again, hasn't it?
It has. And, you know, I think it's, and I've mentioned before, like, I think it's good for everybody to have more options to vote more often on different days. You know, there are a lot of, people have, they have work. They can't go on just one day with paper ballots like Trump may have suggested that we do. But, yes, the Republican Party, despite what Trump has told them to do, has really gotten behind this, as have we. And I would not discourage it. I would say that everybody should be looking for more ways and more times that people can vote. It's about democracy. This election's about democracy, and that's what we should be doing.
John, you made your bones in Arizona politics, where based on ballot data compiled by a Democratic group called Uplift, Republican ballots surged in the initial days of voting, tapering off to a pace more like 2020. But you were way ahead of the curve on this, weren't you? This is the way it's done in Arizona. Will the rest of the country catch up?
Absolutely. I think in Arizona, and for one thing, it is an older population, as the previous guest said. and they do appreciate the opportunity to vote early. And so we saw that really starting in 2010 and even before, when we tried to work to add people to the permanent early vote list, so they automatically receive a ballot every single election, and then we can spend our energy chasing those votes and making sure that people actually take advantage of the opportunity to get their votes in early. So I think it's a good system. It's a very secure system. It works. And other than in 2020 and 2022, it really did benefit Republicans. So I'm thrilled with these numbers so far and hope that Republicans continue to get their ballots in.
Well, so what is the impact, if there is any, on voting that makes things different here, Krista? This was seen in 2020 as an advantage for Democrats. Does this somehow even the playing field and create more noise around closing arguments, knowing people aren't waiting till November 5th?
I mean, I think that the Republicans have caught up on, early voting and that type of thing. I think we have to look at voting between now and election night, and then perhaps
We're just
beyond.
starting in some cases.
Right. I think that the number of women that are coming out is very encouraging for Democrats in certain seats. I think Ruben Guy, if we're looking at Arizona in particular, it's interesting because I think Ruben Gallego is definitely going to win that Senate seat. So it'll be interesting to see. I think this year might be a little bit of a new thing where so many people are early voting. That how many people are going to vote on Election Day? What does that breakdown look like? We won't know until afterwards. And then, I think a lot of the campaign strategists like us will be looking to that to say, okay, how does that inform how we go forward with getting out the vote?
Does it challenge the idea here, John, the concept that if it's a Donald Trump win, we're going to find out before we go home on election night? If it's a Kamala Harris win, check back on the weekend. It's going to be like 2020 because so many states will take time to count early ballots, and a lot of them are going to be colored blue. Is that still the way you're looking at it?
Look, certainly with Arizona and a number of other states, I've cautioned friends, family members, clients, don't expect to have a clear-cut winner on election night. And that's okay. It's much more important that we get this right. I think we can all agree that we should not have a rush to call any races before we know who's won. We should not have a rush to count these ballots. We should be methodical. We should be efficient. But yeah, I mean, in Arizona, especially those late arriving absentee ballots, they need to have make sure the signatures match, make sure that the votes are legitimate. Then they go through an entire process. But at the end of the day, I think we can all agree it's most important. Let's get it right. And Arizona, and I think, the vast majority of states do a very, very good job, even if it doesn't happen as quickly as we might like. They're not worried about our schedule. They're worried about getting it right.
What did Democrats do when Donald Trump declares victory at 10 o'clock at night on November 5th?
I think everybody's prepared for that. He's going to do that. He has been sowing the seeds to, talk about how if he loses or, there's this election's been rigged. We've seen this story.
Is there going to be a response?
Seen this story before. Of course, there's going. Yes, of course, there's going to be a war room. There's going to be people all across the country talking about this. But going back to there are poll watchers and people who are counting the votes. I mean, it's a very safe process that we have in all of these states. So I think we need to rely on the secretaries of state in the various states, particularly in these battleground states, who are reassuring the public that this is a free and fair election, and the states are doing the right thing, and we should trust them to do that.
Well, we also remember a lot of the election volunteer workers who are already at it, leaving their families every day to dedicate their time to this cause all over the country, and we salute them. Coming up with our panel, Kamala Harris is in Pennsylvania for a town hall. Be on CNN tonight. Well, Donald Trump hits the stump in Georgia. We're going to look at the candidate's campaign plan with our political panel next on Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and Radio.
Donald Trump is increasingly unhinged and unstable. And in a second term, people like John Kelly would not be there.
It's the Vice President, Kamala Harris, earlier today at the Vice President's residence up at the Naval Observatory here in Washington, D.C., responding to comments made to the New York Times by Donald Trump's former chief of staff, retired General John Kelly. You've heard about this, the Hitler talk and so forth. It's been driving the conversation in the campaign, and we turn it now to our political panel. Kristen Hahn, John Seaton with us. John, what do you make of the general going out here to do this now. These reports of these conversations about Donald Trump referring to Hitler, saying there were, I guess, good things that he had done or something, have been in the air for some time, for years, actually. What prompts the retired general to do this now?
And you obviously have to talk to General Kelly about that. And look, he's a man with a very distinguished record and honor his service. It does beg the question, of course, and I think a lot of people are curious, why wait so long? If you heard something that was that offensive, that outrageous while you were there, A, how long did you stay after you heard that? And B, why wait until 2 weeks before the election to talk about it? So I do think there are questions here, and it's obviously up to the Trump campaign to determine how they respond. And again, I can't speak for why the general waited as long as he did to talk about it, but he certainly has made some waves in the last couple weeks of this campaign.
Well, Kristen, a lot of Republicans say there's some sort of conspiracy with the media. They're doing this to create some kind of October surprise, but it isn't new. The revelations aren't new. I wonder if he's trying to give cover to other former administration officials, other generals, to say the same thing.
I'm not a member of the military, but I'm not a super political, partisan person. I will say there is nobody with better integrity and character than John Kelly. It's been reported that he heard. Yeah. And by the way, he has not been silent on Donald Trump. So this isn't the first time he's ever said anything. Just a couple of weeks before the election, he has been a little bit vocal in his criticism of the former president. It's been reported that when the president said that he wanted to use the military, perhaps, to come after his political opponents, which is something that we can all watch a video of, that's something that he had to say something. But he has not been silent up until this point. And so I think we should respect what he has to say.
You wonder what motivates people to get out there. You even wonder what motivates some of the celebrities that we've seen align themselves with these two campaigns. Maybe not a big surprise to see Bruce Springsteen on the trail, but it was a rare sighting in the wild to have Eminem opening for Barack Obama in Detroit. Of course, for some reason, he was the only one who didn't end up rapping on the stage. Here's Barack Obama with his big moment in Detroit.
My palms are sweaty, knees weak, arms are heavy, vomit on my sweater already, mom's spaghetti. I'm nervous, but on the surface I look calm and ready to drop bombs, but I keep on forgetting.
Something tells me he's had that on the workout playlist for a while. John Seaton, is this going to be the Eminem versus Kid Rock campaign?
Well, I don't know about that. It's always very entertaining to watch the last couple of weeks of a campaign. As you've noted, a quarter of the people or more have already voted. The candidates have really said everything that they have to say. The debates are done. And now it's just kind of trying to drive enthusiasm and turnout. So, it's entertaining. It's fun. It's a very serious election. I don't mean to make light of it. It's very, very big decisions for the American people to make. But certainly adding a little bit of panache never hurts.
I think everybody's making light of it, John. I wouldn't apologize. Isn't this the definition of silly season at this point we're in?
I don't know if it's silly. I mean, we've talked about celebrities and whether they make a difference or not. A lot of celebrities seem to come out on the Democratic side. They didn't make a difference, really, when Clinton was running against Trump. I think when, Taylor Swift is tweeting something and then including a link about here's how to register, and she has that many followers, that maybe can do something.
Okay, so the real question is not the one I asked John.
Yeah.
This is the Elon Musk versus Taylor Swift campaign. They're both registering voters for their candidates.
They're registering voters. However, Elon Musk is a little bit different. I mean, she has a lot of followers, has a tweet. Here's the link to go register.
He's giving away $1 million a day.
He's not offering $1 million a day, and she's not. I'm not saying it's legal, right? But she's not giving tens of millions of dollars to the Harris Waltz campaign. So there's a little bit of a difference there, even though everything's technically
we're always striving to find equivalencies here in the campaign. John, let me know if you get that $1 million. John Seaton, it's great to have you alongside Kristen Hahn for our great panel today on Balance of Power. Thank you both for joining us. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter. If you want to read up on all the stories we're covering and know what to expect tomorrow, you can find it on the terminal and online. And we'll meet you back here tomorrow alongside Kaylee Lyons. She'll be back too on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg.